The Miami dawn broke like a reluctant promise, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold that would soon surrender to the merciless heat of another Florida morning. In the sterile corridors of Miami General Hospital, where the scent of industrial disinfectant battled against the lingering aroma of cafeteria coffee, Elena Sofia Martinez moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. Her worn sneakers, their original white now a testament to countless 12-hour shifts, squeaked softly against the polished linoleum as she pushed the steel cart loaded with breakfast trays. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows beneath her eyes, highlighting the exhaustion that had become as much a part of her face as her gentle smile. At 34, Elena carried herself with a dignity that poverty had tried, but failed, to strip away. The hospital cafeteria uniform, a faded blue polo shirt that had seen better days and black slacks that she ironed religiously each night, hung loosely on her small frame. She had lost weight over the past 2 years, not from vanity but from the simple mathematics of survival. When there's only enough food for 2 people, a mother doesn't count herself among them. Buenos dias, Mrs. Patterson, Elena whispered to the elderly woman in room 312, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her Cuban heritage. She arranged the breakfast tray with the same care a chef might present a 5-course meal, ensuring the orange juice was positioned just so, the plastic fork aligned perfectly with the institutional eggs that bore no resemblance to the fluffy, herb-infused tortillas she used to create in another life. Mrs. Patterson's roomy eyes focused on Elena's face with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of grace. "You're an angel, dear," she murmured, her weathered hand reaching out to touch Elena's wrist. "I can tell, you understand suffering." Elena's breath caught in her throat, but her smile never wavered. "We all have our crosses to bear, Senora. Today is a gift, that's why they call it the present." As she moved through the hospital corridors, Elena's mind drifted, as it often did during these early morning hours, to the life that had been ripped away from her like a tablecloth yanked from beneath a carefully set table. 2 years ago, she hadn't been Elena Martinez, cafeteria worker. She had been Elena Martinez, chef and co-owner of Corazon, the little Cuban restaurant that had been her grandmother's dream, her parents' legacy, and her daughter's birthright. Corazon. The word itself meant heart in Spanish, and it had been exactly that, the beating heart of a community, a place where the aroma of black beans and plantains mingled with the laughter of 3 generations sharing stories over Café Cubano that could wake the dead and ropa vieja that could heal any broken soul. The memory hit her like a physical blow, the morning she had arrived at the restaurant to find the eviction notice taped to the door she had walked through every day for 15 years. Wellington Development Corporation, the letter had read in cold, corporate typeface that seemed to mock the hand-painted sign above her head. 60 days to vacate. Non-negotiable. Progress waits for no one. Elena shook her head, forcing herself back to the present as she entered the break room where her supervisor, a kind woman named Janet whose own struggles were written in the lines around her eyes, was counting the morning's inventory. "Elena, honey," Janet said without looking up from her clipboard, "you've got that afternoon cleaning job today, right?" "Mrs. Henderson called to confirm, and she specifically requested you again." "See, Janet. Thank you." Elena reached for her time card, her fingers automatically finding the worn edges where she had handled it countless times. "I finish here at noon, then I have 2 hours with Mrs. Henderson before the soup kitchen," Janet finished, finally looking up with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Elena, sweetheart, you're going to run yourself into the ground. 3 jobs is too much for anyone, especially a single mother." Elena's voice carried no bitterness, only the weary acceptance of someone who had long ago stopped fighting against the tide and learned instead to swim with it. "Mi abuela used to say that God gives the hardest battles to his strongest soldiers. I choose to believe I'm strong enough for this fight." Janet's expression softened. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman." She was, Elena replied, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the small silver cross that hung at her throat, the only piece of jewelry she had kept when everything else had to be sold. She taught me that there's always enough love to go around, even when there's not enough of anything else. Meanwhile, 47 floors above the bustling streets of downtown Miami, in a tower of glass and steel that pierced the sky like an accusatory finger, Marcus Wellington III stood before floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city spread beneath him like a chessboard. The morning sun, filtered through specially treated glass that eliminated glare and heat, cast everything in a cool, bluish tint that made the world below seem distant and somehow unreal. His office occupied an entire corner of the Wellington Tower, a monument to glass and chrome that his grandfather had built and his father had expanded, but which Marcus had transformed into something colder, more efficient, and infinitely more profitable. The space was a study in minimalist luxury, Italian marble floors that reflected the sparse, expensive furniture, original Picasso sketches that he had purchased not for their beauty but for their investment value, and a desk carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood that cost more than most people earned in a year. Marcus adjusted the cuffs of his custom-tailored Armani shirt, a gesture he performed unconsciously when deep in thought. At 42, he possessed the kind of lean, angular features that magazines called aristocratic, though his family's wealth had been earned through steel and sweat only 3 generations ago. His grandfather had been a man who understood the weight of dirt under his fingernails, his father had been a man who remembered that weight even as he washed it away. Marcus, however, had never known anything but the antiseptic cleanliness of inherited privilege. The irony was not lost on him that he stood in a tower bearing his family name, looking down at a city that his decisions could reshape with the stroke of a pen, yet he felt more disconnected from humanity than ever before. The recent scandals, the housing development that had displaced hundreds of low-income families, the environmental cover-up at the Miami Beach project, the leaked audio of him referring to city council members as easily purchased commodities, had created what his public relations team euphemistically called image challenges. "Sir." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom system, pulling him from his reverie. "Your 10 o'clock is here." The documentary team. Marcus turned away from the window, his reflection catching momentarily in the glass, a man in a $3,000 suit who looked like he had everything and felt like he had nothing. "Send them in, Miranda." The documentary project had been his PR team's idea, a calculated attempt to humanize his public image through what they called authentic storytelling. The plan was simple. Marcus would spend several weeks undercover among Miami's homeless population, documenting their struggles with hidden cameras, then produce a feature-length documentary that would showcase his newfound understanding of poverty and his commitment to social justice. It was, he knew, a performance. But it was a performance that could save his reputation and, more importantly, secure the city contracts that would make his next development project, a luxury condominium complex on some prime Little Havana real estate, not just possible but profitable beyond imagination. The documentary crew filed into his office, 3 young, earnest-looking individuals who spoke in passionate tones about authentic narratives and giving voice to the voiceless. Marcus nodded at the appropriate moments, signed the contracts they placed before him, and agreed to begin filming the following week. What he didn't know, as he stood in his climate-controlled tower looking down at the ant-like figures moving through the streets below, was that one of those figures was a woman whose life he had destroyed without ever knowing her name. He didn't know about the little girl who drew pictures of restaurants on the backs of eviction notices, or about the grandmother's recipes that lived on in a cramped apartment kitchen where miracles were performed with donated ingredients and unlimited love. He didn't know that in exactly 6 days, he would walk into St. Catherine's soup kitchen dressed in clothes that costume designers had carefully aged and distressed, carrying cameras hidden in buttons and belts, seeking footage that would resurrect his reputation. And he certainly didn't know that the woman who would serve him soup with gentle hands and a generous heart would be the same woman whose dreams he had bulldozed to build his empire of glass and steel. But Elena knew about suffering. Elena knew about loss. And Elena knew, with the bone-deep certainty that comes from having lost everything except faith itself, that sometimes the universe has a way of bringing people exactly where they need to be, even when they don't know they need to be there. As the Miami sun climbed higher into the sky, casting long shadows across a city divided between those who had everything and those who had learned to find abundance in nothing at all, the stage was set for a collision that would change everything. The morning shift at Miami General was ending. The afternoon cleaning jobs awaited. And tonight, as she did every Tuesday and Thursday, Elena Martinez would stand behind a soup pot in St. Catherine's kitchen, ladling hope into bowls for anyone hungry enough to receive it. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow's hunger would arrive wearing a $50,000 watch and carrying secrets that would unravel everything she thought she knew about justice, forgiveness, and the true meaning of redemption. The afternoon sun slanted through the grimy windows of Elena's cramped apartment, casting golden rectangles across the peeling rose-patterned wallpaper that had once been cheerful but now seemed to whisper stories of better days. 8-year-old Sofia Martinez sat cross-legged on the threadbare carpet, her dark curls falling like a curtain around her face as she worked intently on her latest masterpiece, a crayon drawing of a restaurant with bright yellow windows and a sign that read Corazon in careful, childish letters. Elena paused in the doorway, her cleaning supplies still clutched in hands that smelled of industrial bleach and other people's homes, watching her daughter pour love and longing onto paper with the fierce concentration that only children possess. The drawing was remarkably detailed for an 8-year-old, tiny tables with checkered cloths, stick figures of families sharing meals, and even a small figure behind the counter that Sofia had carefully labeled Mommy in purple crayon. "That's beautiful, mi amor," Elena said softly, setting down her bucket and kneeling beside her daughter. "Tell me about this one." Sofia looked up, her eyes, the same warm brown as her grandmother Esperanza's had been, shining with the kind of hope that breaks and mends a mother's heart simultaneously. "It's bigger than the real Corazon was, Mommy. See? I made the kitchen twice as big, and there's a special table just for families with little kids, and look." She pointed to a section of the drawing filled with green scribbles. "A garden where we can grow our own herbs, just like Bisabuela used to tell us about." Elena's throat tightened. Her daughter had never known the original Corazon. Sofia had been only 6 when the restaurant was taken, too young to understand the complexities of eviction notices and corporate acquisitions, but old enough to absorb the grief that had settled over their family like a heavy blanket. "And this," Sofia continued, pointing to a small red heart drawn above the restaurant's entrance, "is for the Corazon that Bisabuela said every restaurant needs. She said you can't cook good food without putting your heart into it, right, Mommy?" "Right, mi cielo," Elena whispered, gathering her daughter into her arms. The familiar weight of Sofia's small body against her chest was both an anchor and a reminder of everything she was fighting for. Bisabuela was very wise about food, and about hearts. Elena's mind drifted back, as it often did in these quiet moments with Sofia, to the stories her grandmother had told her about the old country, about recipes passed down through generations of women who understood that cooking was an act of love made manifest. But more than that, she remembered the day Esperanza Martinez had first set foot on the soil that would eventually become Corazon. It was 1962, and Elena's grandmother had arrived in Miami with nothing but a suitcase, a heart full of dreams, and a small wooden spoon that had belonged to her own mother. The spoon, carved from Cuban mahogany and worn smooth by decades of stirring sofrito and love into countless meals, had made the journey from Havana to Little Havana, carrying with it the essence of everything Esperanza had been forced to leave behind. Elena rose from the floor and walked to the small kitchen, opening the drawer where she kept her most precious possessions. Beneath the unpaid bills and Sofia's report cards, wrapped carefully in a faded yellow kitchen towel, was the spoon. She lifted it with reverent hands, feeling the familiar grooves her grandmother's fingers had worn into the wood. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. She was 12 years old, standing on a milk crate in the original Corazon's kitchen, watching her grandmother prepare the sofrito that would become the foundation for their famous black beans. The kitchen had been cramped then too, but it pulsed with a different kind of energy, the energy of a dream being lived rather than mourned. Mira, Elena, her grandmother had said, her voice carrying the musical cadence that all the Martinez women shared, cooking is not about the ingredients. Any fool can buy plantains and garlic. Cooking is about intention. When you stir the pot, you stir in your hopes, your prayers, your love for the people who will taste what you make. That's why this spoon is so important, it carries the love of all the women who used it before us. Esperanza had placed the wooden spoon in Elena's small hands, guiding her movements as they stirred the aromatic mixture of onions, peppers, and garlic that formed the holy trinity of Cuban cuisine. This recipe, she continued, came from my grandmother, who learned it from her grandmother. But the secret ingredient, the secret ingredient is something you cannot buy in any store. What is it, bisabuela? 12-year-old Elena had asked, mesmerized by the way the vegetables transformed under her grandmother's patient guidance. Cilantro de monte, Esperanza had whispered conspiratorially. Wild cilantro that grows only in Cuba. I brought seeds with me when I came to this country, and I planted them in the little garden behind our first apartment. Every year, I save seeds to plant the next year, and every year, I put a pinch of those dried leaves into the sofrito. It carries the taste of home, Mija. The taste of the island that lives in our hearts even when we cannot return to it. Elena blinked back tears as she held the spoon, remembering how her grandmother had taught her to recognize the subtle difference that the cilantro de monte made, how it added a depth and complexity to their dishes that no restaurant in Miami could replicate, because no other restaurant had access to the seeds that had traveled across the Florida Straits in an old woman's pocket. The secret ingredient was more than just a spice, it was a connection to their heritage, a thread that tied them to the island they had never seen but carried in their blood. And now, in a twist of fate that would have made Esperanza weep, those precious plants grew wild in the overgrown lot where Corazon once stood, the same lot that Marcus Wellington planned to pave over for his luxury condominiums. Mommy? Sophia's voice pulled Elena back to the present. Why are you crying? Elena quickly wiped her eyes and returned to her daughter's side, clutching the wooden spoon like a talisman. I was just remembering bisabuela, mi amor. Sometimes when we miss someone very much, our hearts overflow a little bit. Sophia studied her mother's face with the intuitive wisdom that children often possess. Is that why you give soup to hungry people? Because your heart overflows? The question caught Elena off guard. She had never explained her volunteer work at St. Catherine's in such terms, but Sophia had captured something essential about why she spent her Tuesday and Thursday evenings ladling soup for strangers when she could have been home, resting her tired feet and spending precious time with her daughter. Maybe, Elena said carefully. Bisabuela used to say that when you have been hungry, really hungry, you never forget what it feels like. And when you never forget what it feels like to be hungry, you can't ignore someone else's hunger. Were we hungry, Mommy? After the bad man took our restaurant? Elena's heart clenched. She had tried so hard to shield Sophia from the worst of their struggles, selling her jewelry piece by piece to ensure her daughter never went to bed with an empty stomach. But children notice everything, even when their mothers think they're protecting them. For a little while, Elena admitted. But we're not hungry now, are we? We have enough. We have each other. And sometimes, having enough means we have enough to share. Sophia nodded solemnly, then returned to her drawing, adding careful details to the restaurant of her dreams. When we get our restaurant back, Mommy, I'm going to help you cook for people. And I'm going to put my corazon into every dish, just like bisabuela taught you. Elena felt a familiar stab of guilt. She had never told Sophia that Corazon was gone forever, that the building where they had created memories and fed the neighborhood had been demolished to make way for a parking garage that served the luxury towers rising like glass monuments to other people's dreams. How could she explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes the world breaks things that cannot be repaired? But perhaps, Elena thought as she watched her daughter's careful artistry, hope was not always about what could be recovered. Perhaps sometimes hope was about what could be created anew. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting longer shadows across their small apartment, Elena prepared for her evening at St. Catherine's soup kitchen. She carefully wrapped the wooden spoon in its yellow towel and returned it to the drawer, but not before pressing it to her lips in a silent promise to the grandmother who had given her everything that mattered, the knowledge that love is an ingredient that never runs out, no matter how much you give away. Tonight, she would serve soup to strangers with the same hands that had learned to cook from a woman who understood that food is love made tangible. She would ladle hope into bowls and offer dignity to anyone humble enough to receive it. And she would never know that tomorrow night, those same hands would serve a bowl of soup to the man who had destroyed her past but who would, perhaps, help her build an unimaginable future. What caught your attention most in Elena's story? Was it her grandmother's wisdom about cooking with love, her daughter's innocent hope for restoring their restaurant, or the way she channels her own pain into serving others? Share in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing how these stories touch your hearts. The warehouse that housed St. Catherine's soup kitchen had once been a place where goods were sorted, stored, and shipped to destinations unknown. Now, on this humid Tuesday evening in October, it served a different purpose, sorting hope from despair, storing dignity in the faces of the forgotten, and shipping kindness to souls who had lost their way in a city that moved too fast for broken hearts to keep pace. Elena arrived 20 minutes early, as she always did, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder containing the special ingredients she brought to supplement the kitchen's donated supplies. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like mechanical insects, casting their harsh glow over the rows of folding tables and plastic chairs that would soon be filled with Miami's invisible population. Father Miguel Santos was already there, his silver hair catching the light as he bent over a large pot, stirring with the methodical patience of a man who understood that good things could not be rushed. At 58, he moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to find purpose in service after losing everything that had once defined him. Buenas tardes, Padre, Elena called softly, not wanting to startle him from his meditative stirring. Ah, Elena, mi hija, Father Santos replied without looking up, his voice carrying the warm authority that had made him a confessor to the broken-hearted and a beacon to the lost. Perfect timing. I was just thinking about your grandmother's sofrito recipe. These donated vegetables need the kind of magic that only comes from hands that remember love. Elena smiled, setting down her bag and rolling up her sleeves. This was the ritual that grounded her, that reminded her who she was beneath the exhaustion and worry. She pulled out the small containers she had prepared that afternoon, garlic crushed with sea salt, onions diced with the precision her grandmother had taught her, bell peppers cut into perfect cubes that would release their sweetness slowly into the simmering pot. And from the bottom of her bag, wrapped in parchment paper like a precious secret, a small portion of cilantro de monte that she had carefully harvested from the abandoned lot where Corazon once stood. The wild cilantro had grown back with stubborn persistence in the cracked concrete, as if the land itself remembered what love tasted like. As Elena began her work, transforming the donated ingredients into something that would nourish both body and spirit, Father Santos watched her with the quiet attention of a man who recognized miracles in everyday actions. He had known Elena for 2 years now, since the week after Corazon closed, when she had appeared at his kitchen like a wounded bird seeking shelter. There's something different about tonight, Father Santos said, adjusting the flame beneath the massive stock pot. I can feel it in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm when everything becomes possible. Elena looked up from her chopping, studying the priest's weathered face. Father Santos had an uncanny ability to sense things before they happened, a gift that some called intuition and others called grace. Different how, Padre? I'm not sure yet, he admitted, his eyes distant. But I have the feeling that tonight, someone will come through those doors who needs what only you can give, and perhaps, someone who has something you need, even if you don't know it yet. Before Elena could ask what he meant, the doors opened with a metallic groan that echoed through the cavernous space. The first guests began arriving, regulars whose faces Elena knew, whose stories she carried in her heart like a catalogue of human resilience. There was Mrs. Dorothy, a 73-year-old woman who had lost her apartment when her pension proved insufficient for Miami's rising rents. She always asked for extra crackers, which Elena suspected she saved for breakfast the next morning. There was Tommy, a Vietnam veteran whose nightmares had cost him his job, his wife, and his home, but who still said, please, and thank you, with the precision of a man who refused to let circumstances steal his manners. And there was Sarah, a young mother with 2 children who had fled an abusive husband and now lived in her car, timing her visits to the soup kitchen around her kids' school schedule so they would never know that their picnic dinners in the park were actually their only reliable meal of the day. Elena greeted each person with the same gentle warmth, ladling soup with the care of a mother feeding her own children. She had learned their preferences over the months. Mrs. Dorothy liked extra vegetables, Tommy preferred his soup hot enough to steam, and Sarah always needed a second portion that she would discreetly wrap in napkins for later. You're an angel, sweetheart, Mrs. Dorothy said, as she did every Tuesday and Thursday, her arthritic hands wrapped around the warm bowl like a prayer. Just returning the favor, Senora, Elena replied, as she always did. We're all angels here, taking care of each other. As the evening progressed and the warehouse filled with the quiet sounds of grateful hunger being satisfied, Elena found herself watching the door with an unusual sense of anticipation. Father Santos's words had planted a seed of expectation in her mind, and she found herself wondering what kind of miracle might walk through their doors tonight. She didn't have to wonder long. At 7:45, as the peak dinner rush was beginning to wind down, the door opened again. The man who entered was clearly trying to blend in, but something about his posture, too straight, too controlled, marked him as different from their usual guests. His clothes were appropriately worn, jeans with carefully placed patches, a flannel shirt that had been artfully faded, work boots that looked authentically scuffed. But Elena's trained eye, honed by years of observing people from all walks of life, noticed things others might miss. His hands were soft, uncalloused. His haircut, despite being styled to look unkempt, had the precision that only came from expensive salons. And his eyes held the particular kind of wariness that belonged to someone who had never truly known vulnerability but was trying to perform it. Marcus Wellington stood in the doorway of St. Catherine's soup kitchen, surrounded by cameras he couldn't see but knew were there, recording every moment of his carefully orchestrated journey into the world of Miami's forgotten. The wireless microphone taped to his chest felt heavy as a stone, and the tiny camera embedded in his shirt button seemed to burn against his skin like a guilty conscience. The plan had been simple: arrive at the soup kitchen, blend in with the homeless population, capture authentic footage of poverty and desperation, then return to his tower with enough material to craft a documentary that would rehabilitate his public image. His PR team had spent weeks preparing him, coaching him on the right posture, the appropriate expressions of need, the subtle signs of malnutrition he should mimic. What they hadn't prepared him for was the warmth. The warehouse, which should have felt depressing and institutional, instead felt welcoming. The fluorescent lights, harsh as they were, couldn't diminish the genuine smiles of the volunteers. The industrial tables and plastic chairs couldn't mask the sense of community that filled the space like incense. And the woman behind the serving counter, the woman who was now looking at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through his expensive disguise to something deeper, radiated a kind of grace that no amount of money could purchase. "Good evening," Elena said as Marcus approached the serving station, her voice carrying the musical accent that had been shaped by 3 generations of Cuban women who understood survival. "You're new here. Welcome to St. Catherine's." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. Up close, the woman was younger than he had expected, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that moved with the efficient grace of someone who had spent their life working. But it was her eyes that unsettled him, warm brown eyes that looked at him not with the suspicion he expected, but with genuine concern. "Are you hungry?" she asked, ladling soup into a bowl without waiting for his answer. The aroma that rose from the serving pot was nothing like the institutional food he had expected. This smelled like home. Like comfort. Like someone had put their heart into making sure that even people who had nothing could have something beautiful. Marcus's voice came out rougher than he intended, and he realized with surprise that he actually was hungry. The stress of the day, the unfamiliarity of his situation, had left him genuinely empty. "Yes. Thank you." Elena studied his face as she handed him the bowl, and for a moment, Marcus felt completely exposed. It was as if those warm eyes could see past his carefully constructed facade to the emptiness that wealth and success had failed to fill. "You're shivering," she observed, and Marcus realized she was right. Despite the warehouse's warmth, despite the mild October evening, his body was trembling with a combination of nerves and genuine cold from the warehouse's industrial air conditioning. Without hesitation, Elena reached behind her and grabbed a cardigan, soft, worn, obviously her own, and draped it around his shoulders. The gesture was so natural, so instinctive, that Marcus knew it wasn't being performed for his hidden cameras. This woman saw a cold, hungry person, and her immediate response was to provide warmth and food. The cardigan smelled faintly of vanilla and sofrito, of long days and gentle hands, and Marcus found himself pulling it closer around his shoulders not because he was cold, but because he couldn't remember the last time someone had taken care of him without expecting anything in return. "Better?" Elena asked, and Marcus could only nod, afraid that if he spoke, his voice would betray the emotion that was threatening to overwhelm him. As he found a seat at one of the folding tables, Marcus tried to remember his purpose here. He was supposed to be documenting poverty, capturing the desperation and degradation that would make his audience feel both sympathy and superiority. Instead, he found himself in a place that felt more like a family kitchen than a charity operation. At the table next to him, an elderly woman was showing photos of her grandchildren to a young mother who listened with genuine interest. Across the room, a grizzled man in a Vietnam veteran's cap was helping Father Santos stack chairs, their easy camaraderie speaking of a friendship built on mutual respect rather than pity. And behind the serving counter, the woman who had given him her sweater, whose name tag read, Elena, continued ladling soup with the same care she had shown him, treating each person as if they were the most important guest she had ever served. Marcus lifted the spoon to his lips and tasted the soup, and something inside him shifted fundamentally. This wasn't the watery, flavorless charity food he had expected. This was transcendent. Rich and complex, with layers of flavor that spoke of skill and love and ingredients that had been chosen with care. This was food that had been made by someone who understood that dignity came not just from having enough to eat, but from eating something that honored the humanity of the person consuming it. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his life, Marcus felt truly hungry. Not for food, but for whatever it was that allowed someone to pour this much care into serving strangers. He felt hungry for the warmth in Elena's eyes, for the easy community that surrounded him, for the sense of purpose that seemed to fill every volunteer in this converted warehouse. He felt hungry for something he couldn't name, but which he suspected might be the very thing he had spent his entire life running from, the terrifying, liberating possibility of being truly seen and valued for something other than his net worth. As Marcus sat in the warm circle of St. Catherine's kitchen, wearing a stranger's sweater and tasting soup that somehow managed to nourish more than just his body, he had no idea that the woman serving him had once stood in her own kitchen, in her own restaurant, creating the same kind of magic he was experiencing now. He had no idea that Elena Martinez had lost everything when Wellington Development bought her block and demolished her dreams to make room for progress and profit. And he had no idea that tomorrow, when his PR team reviewed the footage from tonight's poverty experiment, they would capture not just his moment of vulnerability, but the face of the woman whose life he had destroyed, and the moment when her simple act of kindness began to crack the armor around his heart. But Elena knew about kindness. Elena knew about feeding hungry souls. And as she watched the strange man in the carefully distressed clothes wrap her cardigan around his shoulders like a shield against loneliness, she felt that familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling that made her harvest wild cilantro from abandoned lots and transform donated vegetables into something that tasted like love. Someone, her heart whispered, needed to be fed. And Elena Martinez, who had learned from 3 generations of women that love is the only ingredient that multiplies when you give it away, was exactly the right person to do the feeding. If this story is touching your heart, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of hope, redemption, and the unexpected ways our lives intersect. Your support helps us bring these powerful narratives to life. The Wellington Towers Executive Conference Room existed in a realm of perpetual artificial twilight, where floor-to-ceiling windows filtered the Miami skyline into something distant and unreal. At 9:15 a.m. on Wednesday morning, the room hummed with the quiet efficiency of money being made and reputations being managed. Marcus sat at the head of the polished obsidian table, his fingers drumming an unconscious rhythm against its surface as he watched the footage from the previous evening play across the wall-mounted screens. His PR team, 3 sharp-suited individuals who spoke in percentages and demographics, had already viewed the preliminary cuts and were preparing their strategic recommendations. "The authenticity is remarkable, Mr. Wellington," said Rebecca Chen, his head of public relations, her manicured finger tracing patterns on her tablet as she spoke. "The shivering, the genuine hunger in your eyes, our focus groups are going to eat this up. It's exactly the kind of vulnerable moment that transforms public perception." On the screen, Marcus watched himself accept the bowl of soup from Elena's gentle hands, saw the moment she draped her cardigan around his shoulders, witnessed his own face soften in a way that surprised him. The hidden cameras had captured everything in crisp, intimate detail, every emotion he thought he had hidden, every crack in the armor he had spent decades constructing. "The woman serving the soup," said Jonathan Myers, his media strategist, pausing the footage on Elena's face as she smiled at Marcus with genuine warmth. "She's perfect. Exactly the kind of authentically compassionate figure we need to anchor the narrative. Hispanic, obviously working class, but carrying herself with dignity. She photographs beautifully, very maternal, very sympathetic." Marcus found himself leaning forward, studying Elena's face on the screen. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the soup kitchen, her features had seemed softer, more intimate. On the high-definition display, he could see details he had missed in person, the exhaustion around her eyes that spoke of long hours and longer worries, the careful way she had positioned his bowl to ensure the soup wouldn't spill, the unconscious grace with which she had offered her own sweater to a stranger. "We'll want to feature her prominently in the documentary," Rebecca continued, making notes on her tablet. "Get her to sign a release, maybe interview her about the impact of your foundation's work in the community. The contrast between your wealth and her poverty will create exactly the kind of narrative tension that drives engagement." "Her poverty?" Marcus asked, the words feeling strange in his mouth. On screen, Elena moved with the confident efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who found purpose and meaning in their work. She didn't look impoverished to him, she looked abundant. "Well, obviously," Jonathan said with a slight laugh. "She's serving soup in a homeless shelter. The optics are perfect, successful businessman learning humility from the noble poor. It's practically a Dickens novel." Marcus's assistant, Miranda, entered the conference room carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who had discovered something unexpected. "Sir, I have those background checks you requested on the soup kitchen volunteers. I thought you might want to review them before the next phase of filming." "Excellent," Rebecca said, reaching for the folder. We'll want to ensure none of them have any criminal backgrounds or controversial associations that could damage the narrative. But as Miranda handed the folder to Marcus instead, her expression grew troubled. "Sir, there's something you need to see. About the woman from last night, Elena Martinez." Marcus opened the folder, expecting to find the standard background information his security team compiled on anyone who appeared in his documentaries. Instead, he found himself staring at a photograph that made his blood run cold, a newspaper clipping from 2 years ago, featuring Elena Martinez standing in front of a small restaurant with a bright red sign that read, "Corazon." The headline read, "Little Havana Businesses Forced to Close as Wellington Development Acquires Historic Block." The room seemed to tilt around Marcus as he read the article, his eyes scanning the words that described Elena's family restaurant, the community it served, the dreams that had been crushed when his company exercised its right of eminent domain to clear the block for luxury development. "This restaurant has been in my family for 3 generations, Marcus read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just a business, it's the heart of our community. But I understand that progress waits for no one." The quote was attributed to Elena Martinez, owner and head chef of Corazon Restaurant. The silence in the conference room was deafening. Rebecca and Jonathan exchanged glances that spoke of crisis management protocols being mentally activated, while Miranda stood frozen by the door as if she regretted bringing the information at all. Marcus continued reading, each word hitting him like a physical blow. The article described how Corazon had served authentic Cuban cuisine to the Little Havana community for over 40 years, how Elena had learned to cook from her grandmother Esperanza, how the restaurant had been struggling financially but had never missed a payment until the building was sold to Wellington Development. There was a photograph of Elena standing in the restaurant's kitchen, her hands covered in flour, her face bright with the kind of joy that comes from doing work you love. She looked younger in the picture, less worn by worry, her eyes holding a lightness that Marcus realized he hadn't seen in person the night before. And then, at the bottom of the folder, he found the demolition report. The building that had housed Corazon Restaurant had been torn down 6 months after the article was published. In its place now sat a parking garage that served the luxury condominiums his company had built on the adjacent lots. "Sir." Rebecca's voice seemed to come from very far away. This is a complication, but it's manageable. We can restructure the narrative to focus on reconciliation, perhaps even position this as a heartwarming story of how business leaders can make amends for past, get out." Marcus's voice was quiet, but it cut through Rebecca's strategic planning like a blade. "Sir. All of you. Get out of my office. Now." The PR team gathered their materials with the efficient haste of people who recognized when their expertise was no longer welcome. Miranda lingered for a moment, as if she wanted to say something, but Marcus's expression made it clear that he needed to be alone with the devastating revelation that had just shattered his carefully constructed world. When the door closed behind them, Marcus found himself staring at Elena's photograph with the intensity of a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. The woman who had served him soup with such gentle care, who had wrapped her own sweater around his shoulders, who had looked at him with eyes that held no judgment or suspicion, that woman was the same person whose life he had destroyed with a casual signature on a development contract. He remembered the moment now, sitting in this same conference room 2 years ago, reviewing the acquisition paperwork for the Little Havana block. The legal team had mentioned that several small businesses would need to be relocated, but they had been statistics on a spreadsheet, not people with faces and dreams and 3 generations of family recipes. Marcus rose from his chair and walked to the windows, pressing his palms against the cool glass as he looked down at the city spread below. Somewhere in that maze of streets and buildings was the parking garage that had been built over Elena's dreams. Somewhere down there was the cramped apartment where she now lived, working 3 jobs to support herself and her daughter, the daughter whose existence Marcus had just learned about from the background report. Sofia Martinez, age 8. Honor roll student at Miami Elementary. Draws pictures of restaurants in her spare time. The irony was so profound it felt like a physical weight in his chest. He had gone to St. Catherine's soup kitchen seeking to document poverty for his own public relations purposes, and instead had encountered the very woman whose poverty he had created. She had fed him, literally and figuratively, offering nourishment and warmth without knowing that he was the architect of her suffering. On the conference room screen, the paused footage still showed Elena's face as she smiled at him, her expression holding nothing but genuine kindness for a stranger she believed to be hungry and alone. There was no recognition in her eyes, no hint that she had any idea who he was. To her, he had simply been another person in need of food and warmth. Marcus thought about the soup he had tasted, the complex, layered flavors that spoke of skill and love and ingredients chosen with care. He thought about Elena's hands as she had ladled it into his bowl, the same hands that had once created magic in the kitchen of Corazon restaurant, the same hands that now cleaned other people's houses during the day and served soup to strangers in the evening. And he thought about the cardigan she had draped around his shoulders, soft and worn and smelling of vanilla and spices, given freely to someone she had never met and would probably never see again. The weight of what he had discovered was crushing. Every dollar in his bank account, every luxury in his tower, every success he had claimed as evidence of his business acumen, all of it was built on the dreams of people like Elena Martinez. He had told himself that business was about difficult decisions, that progress required sacrifice, that the greater good sometimes demanded individual losses. But seeing Elena's face, remembering the warmth in her eyes as she cared for him, Marcus realized that he had been lying to himself. The greater good he had been serving was his own. The progress he had been making was toward his own wealth and power, regardless of the human cost. His phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca, called emergency meeting with crisis management team for 2 p.m. We can spin this as a redemption story, very marketable angle. The universe has given us a gift. Marcus stared at the message until the words blurred before his eyes. A gift. Rebecca saw Elena's pain, her family's destroyed legacy, his own devastating discovery of his role in her suffering, and she saw it as a gift. A marketing opportunity. A chance to turn his genuine horror at his own actions into another tool for managing his public image. He deleted the message without responding. Outside his windows, Miami continued its relentless forward motion, unaware that in a glass tower 47 floors above the street, a man was experiencing the kind of revelation that changes everything. Marcus Wellington III, who had built his identity on being stronger, smarter, and more ruthless than anyone else, was discovering what it felt like to be utterly, completely wrong. The woman who had served him soup was not a character in his redemption story. She was not a symbol of the noble poor or a convenient prop for his documentary about learning humility. She was Elena Martinez, whose grandmother's dreams had survived revolution and exile only to be destroyed by a man who had never bothered to learn her name. She was Elena Martinez, who had lost everything and somehow found the grace to feed strangers. She was Elena Martinez, and Marcus Wellington was the villain in her story. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, sending him stumbling back from the windows to collapse into his chair. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Wellington understood what it meant to feel truly, devastatingly small. Father Miguel Santos had always believed that the most important conversations happened in the spaces between words, in the silences that allowed truth to settle like dust after a storm. On Thursday morning, as he sat in his small office behind St. Catherine's soup kitchen, reviewing the volunteer schedules and donation receipts that kept their operation running, he was thinking about the stranger who had come through their doors 2 nights before. The man had been carrying secrets like stones in his pockets, Father Santos could tell. In his 20 years of ministry, 15 in the priesthood and 5 as a lawyer before that, he had learned to recognize the weight that guilt carried in a person's posture, the particular way shame manifested in the space between someone's shoulders. But it wasn't the stranger's guilt that occupied Father Santos's thoughts as he sipped his morning coffee from a chipped mug that had been a gift from the parish children. It was Elena's response to him. The way she had offered her cardigan without hesitation, the extra care she had taken with his bowl of soup, the gentle concern that had radiated from her like warmth from a candle. Elena Martinez had a gift for seeing hunger that went beyond the physical need for food. She could recognize spiritual starvation, emotional emptiness, the kind of profound loneliness that wealth and status could never fill. It was a gift that made her an extraordinary volunteer and, Father Santos suspected, would soon make her an instrument of something much larger than either of them could imagine. The knock on his office door came at exactly 10:30 a.m., interrupting his contemplation. "Come in," he called, setting down his coffee and straightening the papers on his desk. The man who entered was the same stranger from Tuesday night, but transformed. Gone were the carefully distressed clothes and the practiced vulnerability. Instead, Marcus Wellington stood in Father Santos's doorway wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, his hair professionally styled, his entire appearance screaming wealth and power. But his eyes still carried the same haunted quality they had held when Elena draped her cardigan around his shoulders. "Father Santos?" Marcus's voice was steady, professional, but Father Santos heard the tremor underneath. "My name is Marcus Wellington. I believe we need to talk." Father Santos gestured to the worn chair across from his desk, studying his unexpected visitor with the careful attention he had once reserved for difficult witnesses when he practiced law. "Please, sit. Would you like some coffee? I'm afraid it's nothing fancy, but it's strong." "No, thank you." Marcus settled into the chair, his movements carrying the controlled precision of someone who was accustomed to being in charge of every situation. "I think you know why I'm here." "I suspect I do," Father Santos replied carefully. "But why don't you tell me in your own words?" Marcus was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on a simple wooden cross that hung on the wall behind Father Santos's desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Elena Martinez. The woman who served me soup Tuesday night. She used to own a restaurant called Corazon." "Yes," Father Santos said simply. "She did. My company is the reason she doesn't own it anymore." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of confession. Father Santos had heard many admissions of wrongdoing over the years, but few had carried the particular quality of devastation that he heard in Marcus Wellington's voice. "I see," Father Santos said finally. "And what brings you to my office today, Mr. Wellington? Guilt? Curiosity? Or perhaps something more complicated than either of those?" Marcus looked up sharply, surprised by the priest's directness. "I don't know," he admitted. "I found out yesterday who she was, and I can't stop thinking about the way she looked at me. Not with suspicion or fear or anger, just kindness. She gave me her sweater, Father. She fed me soup that tasted like..." He struggled for the words. "Like someone had put their heart into making it. And I destroyed her life without ever knowing her name." "Did you?" Father Santos asked mildly, leaning back in his chair. "Destroy her life?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "Of course I did. She lost her restaurant, her livelihood, everything her family had built for 3 generations. She's working 3 jobs now, living in poverty with her daughter. If that's not destruction, what is?" Father Santos was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. In his years of ministry, he had learned that the path to redemption was rarely straightforward, and that sometimes the people who needed healing the most were the ones who had caused the wounds. "Mr. Wellington," he said finally, "may I tell you something about Elena Martinez that might surprise you?" Marcus nodded, leaning forward slightly. "Elena has been volunteering at our soup kitchen for 2 years now, since shortly after her restaurant closed. In that time, I have watched her serve thousands of meals to people who have nothing. I have seen her give away her own food, her own clothes, her own comfort to strangers who needed them more. I have watched her turn donated ingredients into feasts that nourish not just the body but the soul. Father Santos paused, letting his words settle. You say you destroyed her life, Mr. Wellington. But the woman I know, the woman who served you with such grace on Tuesday night, that woman has built a life of extraordinary purpose and meaning from the ashes of what she lost. So perhaps the question isn't whether you destroyed her life, but whether you destroyed the wrong life. Marcus frowned. I don't understand. Elena Martinez was a successful restaurant owner, Father Santos continued. She was comfortable, established, serving primarily people who could afford to pay for good food. But Elena Martinez the volunteer, Elena Martinez the woman who sees hunger wherever it exists and feels compelled to feed it, that woman was born from loss. That woman exists because she learned what it means to have nothing and found grace in the experience. You're saying I did her a favor? Marcus's voice carried an edge of anger. That destroying her restaurant was somehow good for her. I'm saying, Father Santos replied gently, that the Elena who served you soup on Tuesday night is not a victim of circumstances. She is a woman who chose to transform her suffering into service, her loss into love. And if you're looking for someone to blame for her pain, you should start with yourself. But if you're looking for someone to learn from about what it means to be truly wealthy, you couldn't find a better teacher. Marcus was silent, absorbing the priest's words. Finally, he asked, what do you think I should do? Father Santos smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. That's the right question, Mr. Wellington. Not, how can I fix this, or, how can I make this go away, but what should I do? That tells me you might be ready to hear the answer. The priest rose from his desk and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of his office, withdrawing a thick manila folder. Before I became a priest, I was a lawyer specializing in property law. Old habits die hard, and when Elena first started volunteering here, I took the liberty of researching her situation. He handed the folder to Marcus, who opened it with trembling hands. What you'll find in there, Father Santos continued, is a copy of the original deed to the property where Corazon Restaurant stood. The deed that transferred ownership from Elena's grandmother, Esperanza Martinez, to your grandfather, James Wellington, in 1963. Marcus's eyes scanned the document, written in both English and Spanish, trying to parse the formal legal language. I don't understand. My grandfather bought the property legally. Elena's family was compensated. Keep reading, Father Santos said gently. Pay particular attention to Section 7, subsection C. Marcus found the relevant section and read aloud, in the event that the aforementioned property shall cease to serve the cultural and economic needs of the local community, and shall instead be developed for purposes that displace existing residents or businesses without provision for equivalent community benefit, ownership of said property shall revert to the Martinez family or their legal heirs. The words seemed to blur before Marcus's eyes as their meaning sank in. A reversion clause. Your grandfather was a man who understood the importance of community, Father Santos explained. When he bought the property from Esperanza Martinez, he insisted on including that clause to ensure that the land would always serve the people who lived there. He kept his word. The original development included affordable housing, small business spaces, and community areas that benefited the neighborhood. But Marcus's voice trailed off as the full implication hit him. But you developed luxury condominiums that displaced the existing community and provided no equivalent benefit to the local residents, Father Santos finished. Which means, according to the legal contract your grandfather signed, ownership of that property reverted to Elena Martinez the moment you broke ground on your luxury towers. Marcus stared at the document in his hands, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath him. She owns the land my condos are built on. She does, Father Santos confirmed. She just doesn't know it yet. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of children playing in the street outside and the distant hum of traffic on Calle Ocho. Marcus sat frozen, holding a piece of paper that could unravel his entire empire while simultaneously restoring Elena's family legacy. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. "Why not just tell Elena?" Father Santos returned to his seat, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "Because, Mr. Wellington, I believe in redemption. Not the kind that your public relations team manufactures for cameras, but the kind that happens when a person chooses to do the right thing even when no one is watching." He leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had seen both the worst and best of human nature. "You have a choice to make. You can fight this in court, tie Elena up in legal battles she can't afford, and probably maintain ownership through sheer financial power. You can pretend you never learned about the reversion clause and continue as if nothing has changed. Or, Marcus prompted. Or you can choose to be the man who honors his grandfather's intentions and his own newfound understanding of what real wealth looks like." Father Santos smiled. "The man who recognizes that sometimes the universe gives us exactly the opportunity we need to become who we're supposed to be." Marcus looked down at the deed in his hands, then up at the priest who had just handed him the most important decision of his life. Outside the window, he could hear the sounds of Little Havana, the music, the voices, the life that continued to thrive despite developers and displacement and the relentless march of progress. And somewhere in that tapestry of sound was Elena Martinez, probably rushing between her morning shift at the hospital and her afternoon cleaning jobs, carrying her grandmother's wooden spoon and her daughter's dreams and her own unshakable faith that kindness was never wasted. "What kind of man do you think I am, Father?" Marcus asked. Father Santos considered the question carefully. "I think you're a man who has spent his entire life measuring his worth by the wrong standards. But I also think you're a man who understands, perhaps for the first time, what it feels like to be truly hungry, and what it means when someone offers to feed you." Marcus closed the folder and looked directly into the priest's eyes. "If I do this, if I honor the reversion clause, Elena gets her property back. But what happens to the people living in my condos? They bought those apartments in good faith. Now that, Father Santos said with approval, is the question of a man who's beginning to understand that every decision affects more than just himself. And that, Mr. Wellington, is why I believe you might just be ready for what comes next." Marcus Wellington had not slept for 3 days. He sat in his office as the Miami dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, staring at the legal documents spread across his desk like pieces of a puzzle that could either destroy him or transform him. Coffee cups littered his workspace, their contents long cold, evidence of the sleepless nights he'd spent weighing options that all seemed impossible. On one side of the equation was everything he had built, Wellington Development, the luxury towers, the carefully constructed empire that bore his family name. On the other side was a woman who served soup with gentle hands and gave her sweater to strangers, unknowingly sitting on a legal claim that could unravel his entire life's work. But it wasn't the legal implications that kept Marcus awake. It was the memory of Elena's eyes as she looked at him across the serving counter at St. Catherine's, eyes that held no judgment, no suspicion, only the kind of radical compassion that he was beginning to understand might be the rarest currency in the world. His phone buzzed with another message from Rebecca Chen, his 5th attempt since yesterday to schedule an emergency PR strategy session. Marcus deleted it without reading the full text. Whatever spin his team wanted to put on this situation, whatever narrative they wanted to construct around his journey of discovery, felt increasingly irrelevant. This wasn't about public relations anymore. This wasn't about salvaging his reputation or finding a way to turn his mistakes into marketing gold. This was about who he chose to be when no cameras were rolling. Marcus rose from his desk and walked to the windows, pressing his palm against the cool glass as he looked down at the city awakening below. Somewhere in that maze of streets and buildings, Elena Martinez was beginning another day, hospital shift, cleaning jobs, preparation for tonight's volunteer work. She would move through her routine with the same quiet dignity he had witnessed, unaware that a piece of paper signed by his grandfather 60 years ago could change everything. The intercom on his desk crackled to life. "Mr. Wellington. Your 10 a.m. appointment is here." Marcus had made the call yesterday afternoon, reaching out to someone he hadn't spoken to in over 2 years, someone whose opinion he valued more than any board member or business advisor, precisely because she owed him nothing and expected even less. "Send her in, Miranda." The woman who entered his office carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from having survived the worst life can offer and emerged stronger for it. Dar. Ana Gutierrez was 55 years old, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had been Elena's neighbor before the evictions, a pediatrician who had run a free clinic in the space above Corazon restaurant until Wellington Development bought the block. Marcus had asked her to come because he needed to hear the truth from someone who had witnessed firsthand the human cost of his decisions. Dar. Gutierrez was that witness. Dar. Gutierrez, Marcus said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." She ignored his offered handshake and took a seat across from his desk, her gaze moving over the luxury that surrounded them with undisguised assessment. "I'll be honest, Mr. Wellington. When your assistant called yesterday, my first instinct was to hang up. I'm only here because she mentioned Elena Martinez." "I understand," Marcus said, settling into his own chair. "And I appreciate your directness. I asked you here because I need to understand something that my lawyers and accountants can't explain to me. Which is what Elena Martinez was like, before my company destroyed her restaurant. I need to know what I took away from her." Dar. Gutierrez studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his question was genuine or another form of manipulation. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. "Elena Martinez," she said slowly, "was magic." The simplicity of the statement caught Marcus off guard. "Not in any mystical sense, Dar." Gutierrez continued. "But in the way that some people just seem to make everything around them better by existing. Corazon wasn't just a restaurant, Mr. Wellington. It was the living room of our neighborhood." She began to speak, and as her words painted pictures of a world Marcus had never known, he found himself transported to a place that existed now only in memory. Elena would arrive at the restaurant every morning at 5 a.m., Dar. Gutierrez said, her voice taking on the rhythm of someone sharing a beloved story. "I know this because my clinic was upstairs, and I would hear her moving around in the kitchen below, humming old Cuban songs while she prepared the daily sofrito. The smell would drift up through the floors, garlic and peppers and that special spice she grew in the little garden behind the building." Marcus closed his eyes, trying to imagine Elena in her own kitchen, creating the kind of food he had tasted that night at the soup kitchen. "She knew everyone's order by heart, Dar." Gutierrez continued. "Mrs. Hernandez got her café cubano with extra sugar because her diabetes medication made everything taste bitter. Jorge the mechanic got his sandwich on bread that Elena made fresh every Tuesday because his dentures couldn't handle the crusty Cuban bread from the bakery. And the children, oh, the children loved her. Children. Elena kept a jar of hard candies behind the counter, and she would slip them to kids whose parents were counting every penny for their meal. She never made it obvious, never embarrassed anyone. She would just smile and say, "This one's on the house, mi amor," and the parents would nod gratefully, understanding that their dignity was being preserved even as their children were being cared for. Marcus thought about his own childhood, spent in private schools and country clubs where kindness was often calculated and generosity came with expectations attached. He had never known the kind of community Dr. Gutierrez was describing. But it wasn't just the food, she continued. Elena turned that restaurant into a community center without ever calling it that. People brought their troubles to her along with their appetites. When Carmen Rodriguez was going through her divorce, Elena would let her sit in the corner booth for hours, refilling her coffee and listening to her cry. When old Mr. Vasquez lost his wife, Elena made sure he had dinner every night, even when he couldn't pay. How did she afford to do that? Marcus asked. Running a business on charity doesn't seem sustainable. Dar. Gutierrez smiled, the expression transforming her stern features. That's what made Elena special. Somehow, there was always enough. Maybe it was because people who were helped when they had nothing came back to help when they had something. Maybe it was because word spread about the quality of her food and the warmth of her welcome. Or maybe, she paused, her eyes growing distant, maybe it was because Elena understood something that most business owners never learn, that generosity creates abundance. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of truth that he couldn't quite articulate. What happened when the eviction notice was posted? Dar. Gutierrez's expression darkened. I was there that morning. Elena stood in front of the restaurant reading that letter, and I watched her face go through every emotion, shock, anger, despair, acceptance. And then, do you know what she did? Marcus shook his head. She went inside and started cooking. She told everyone that Corazon would be open for business as usual for the remaining 60 days, and that no one who had ever eaten there would leave hungry. She served more meals in those final 2 months than in the previous 6, because people came from all over Miami to say goodbye to something special. Where did the money come from for all that food? Elena sold everything she owned, Dar. Gutierrez said quietly. Her jewelry, her furniture, her car, everything except her grandmother's wooden spoon and the restaurant equipment. She used the money to buy ingredients so she could feed people one last time. On the final night, she invited the entire neighborhood for a farewell dinner. She cooked for 8 hours straight, serving dish after dish until everyone was fed. Marcus found himself leaning forward, captivated by the image of Elena giving everything she had to preserve something that was already lost. And when the last plate was served and the last guest had gone home, Dar. Gutierrez continued, Elena sat alone in her empty restaurant and cried for her grandmother, for her parents, for all the dreams that were being buried under your progress. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of understanding. Marcus realized that he had not just destroyed a business, he had demolished a cornerstone of community, a place where love was served alongside food and dignity was preserved even in poverty. Dar. Gutierrez, he said finally, if you could change what happened, if you could somehow restore what was lost, what would that look like? She studied him carefully, as if trying to determine whether his question was theoretical or something more. Why do you ask? Marcus reached for the folder containing the reversion clause documents, his hands trembling slightly. Because I may have the power to give Elena back more than she lost. But I need to understand what that would mean before I act. As he explained the legal discovery Father Santos had shared, Dar. Gutierrez's expression moved from skepticism to amazement to something that looked like hope. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Wellington, she said finally, are you asking me whether you should honor a legal contract that your grandfather signed 60 years ago? I'm asking you whether honoring that contract would truly help Elena, or whether it would just create a different kind of burden for her. Dar. Gutierrez smiled, and for the first time since entering his office, her expression held warmth. Elena Martinez is the strongest person I know. She has survived losing everything and found a way to build a life of meaning from the pieces. If you give her back her grandmother's land, she won't see it as a burden. She'll see it as an opportunity to create something even more beautiful than what was lost. Even if it means disrupting the lives of the people living in the condos I built. Elena would never displace families to reclaim her property, Dar. Gutierrez said with certainty. That's not who she is. If she regains ownership of that land, she'll find a way to honor both her heritage and the reality of what exists there now. That's what Elena does, she finds ways to feed everyone. Marcus nodded, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, clarity. Not the cold certainty of business decisions based on profit margins and risk assessments, but the warm clarity that comes from finally understanding what the right choice looks like. Dar. Gutierrez, I have one more question. Yes. Do you think Elena Martinez could ever forgive a man who destroyed her life and then tried to make amends? Dar. Gutierrez stood to leave, pausing at the door to look back at him. Mr. Wellington, Elena Martinez gave her sweater to a stranger who was cold. If you're genuinely asking for forgiveness, not as a business strategy but as a human being seeking redemption, I think you'll find that Elena Martinez has enough grace to surprise even herself. As the door closed behind her, Marcus sat alone in his tower, surrounded by all the trappings of success he had once thought mattered. Outside his windows, Miami pulsed with life, a city full of people who understood that wealth meant more than money, that success could be measured in soup bowls filled and strangers warmed. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed a number he had memorized but never called. Father Santos? It's Marcus Wellington. I need to know when Elena Martinez will be at the soup kitchen next. We need to talk. The time for hiding behind lawyers and public relations teams was over. The time for choosing who he wanted to be had arrived. The news broke on a Thursday morning in November, spreading through Miami's media landscape like wildfire through dry grass. Channel 7's investigative reporter, David Chen, had been working the story for weeks, following leads that began with a routine documentary about homelessness and evolved into something far more complex and compelling. Good morning, Miami. I'm David Chen with a story that challenges everything we think we know about wealth, poverty, and the unexpected ways our lives intersect. Elena Martinez was folding towels in the laundry room of the Coral Gables mansion where she worked her afternoon cleaning job when her phone began ringing incessantly. The first call was from her sister Carmen, her voice tight with excitement and confusion. Elena, are you watching the news? Are you seeing this? I'm at work, Carmen. What's happening? It's about you, Hermana. It's about Corazon. Turn on Channel 7 right now. Elena's hands trembled as she pulled up the news app on her phone, squinting at the small screen as David Chen's report unfolded. The footage began with hidden camera video from St. Catherine's soup kitchen, video she didn't remember being taken, showing her serving soup to various guests over the past few weeks. But the focus wasn't on her. The focus was on one particular guest, a man she recognized as the quiet stranger who had come through their doors several times recently, the one to whom she had given her cardigan on that first cold evening. The man being served in this footage, David Chen's voiceover explained, is Marcus Wellington III, CEO of Wellington Development Corporation and one of Miami's wealthiest individuals. What makes this story extraordinary isn't just that a billionaire was eating at a soup kitchen under false pretenses, it's what happened next. Elena sank into a nearby chair, her phone clutched in her trembling hands, as the report continued to unfold. She watched herself on camera, saw her own gentle movements as she ladled soup and offered kindness, unaware that she was being recorded, unaware that the recipient of her care was the same man who had destroyed her family's legacy. Sources close to Wellington Development confirm that Mr. Wellington has made an extraordinary decision in the wake of learning about his connection to Ms. Martinez. This afternoon, he will be announcing the transfer of property ownership worth an estimated $47 million back to the Martinez family, property that includes the land where Ms. Martinez's family restaurant once stood. The phone slipped from Elena's hands, clattering to the floor of the laundry room as the full magnitude of what she was hearing hit her. She thought about the stranger's eyes when she had served him soup, the way he had pulled her cardigan around his shoulders, the gratitude in his expression that had seemed almost desperate. Marcus Wellington III. The name that had appeared on the eviction notices that ended her old life. The man whose company had bulldozed her dreams to make room for glass towers and profit margins. And she had fed him soup. She had given him her sweater. She had looked into his eyes and seen hunger that went deeper than food, loneliness that wealth couldn't touch, and she had responded with the same compassion she offered to every person who walked through St. Catherine's doors. The irony was so profound it took her breath away. Meanwhile, across the city in the Wellington Tower, Marcus stood before a room filled with journalists, lawyers, and television cameras, feeling more exposed than he had ever felt while wearing his billionaire's armor. The prepared statement in his hands felt inadequate to capture the complexity of what had led him to this moment, but it was a beginning. 3 weeks ago, he began, his voice steady despite the chaos of emotions churning in his chest. I embarked on what I believed was a documentary project about homelessness in Miami. I thought I understood poverty because I had studied the statistics, reviewed the reports, written the checks to various charitable organizations. He paused, looking directly into the cameras, thinking about Elena's face as she had served him with such gentle care. What I discovered instead was that I understood nothing about real wealth, the kind of wealth that shows up when someone gives you their sweater on a cold night, when someone feeds you soup that tastes like love, when someone looks at you with kindness even when you don't deserve it. The room was silent except for the soft whir of cameras and the scratching of pens on notepads. Elena Martinez lost her family's restaurant when my company acquired the building where it stood. I never knew her name, never saw her face, never understood that behind the legal documents and property transfers was a woman whose family had poured 3 generations of love into serving their community. Marcus folded his prepared statement and set it aside, choosing to speak from his heart instead of his script. Ms. Martinez had every reason to hate me when she discovered who I was. Instead, she had already fed me, warmed me, and treated me with a dignity I hadn't earned and didn't deserve. Her response to learning my identity wasn't anger or bitterness, it was concern for the families living in the condominiums built on her grandmother's land. The questions came fast and sharp from the assembled reporters, but Marcus had anticipated them. Yes, the property transfer was legally binding, the reversion clause in the original 1963 deed made Elena the rightful owner. No, he was not seeking any compensation or tax benefits from the transfer. Yes, he understood the financial implications for his company and his personal wealth. But the most important question, Marcus continued, isn't about the money. It's about what happens next. Ms. Martinez and I have been working with housing advocates and community leaders to develop a plan that honors both her family's legacy and the needs of the current residents. What he didn't say, what the cameras couldn't capture, was the conversation he and Elena had shared just 2 days before, sitting in Father Santos's office as they worked through the impossible logistics of justice and compassion. Elena had listened as lawyers explained her legal rights, as accountants detailed the property values, as planners outlined development options that could make her wealthy beyond her wildest dreams. And then she had asked the question that confirmed everything Marcus had begun to understand about who she was. What about the families who live in those apartments now? They bought their homes in good faith. What happens to them? It was Elena who had proposed the solution that no lawyer or business advisor would have suggested, converting the luxury condominiums into affordable cooperative housing, with current residents given the option to buy their units at cost. It was Elena who insisted that any new development on the property include community spaces, small business opportunities, and a memorial garden for the neighborhood that had been displaced. And it was Elena who had looked Marcus in the eye and said, "My grandmother always taught me that the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land. Our job is to take care of it so it can take care of the people who come after us." Now, as news vans lined up outside St. Catherine's soup kitchen and reporters tried to capture Elena's story, the ripple effects of her philosophy were already spreading through the community. Mrs. Dorothy, the elderly woman who saved crackers from the soup kitchen for her breakfast, heard about Elena's story on her neighbor's radio and wept for the grace of a world where kindness could be rewarded so dramatically. Tommy, the Vietnam veteran, learned about the property transfer from a fellow vet and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, hoped that the system could sometimes work for good people instead of just rich ones. Sarah, the young mother who brought her children to the soup kitchen disguised as picnics, saw Elena's story on the television in the hospital waiting room where she was applying for a job, and felt inspired to believe that her own situation could change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But perhaps the most significant ripple effect was happening in a small apartment in Little Havana, where 8-year-old Sofia Martinez was carefully adding new details to her crayon drawing of the restaurant that bore her family's name. She had heard her mother crying, not tears of sadness this time, but tears of overwhelming gratitude and possibility. "Mommy," Sofia asked, looking up from her drawing, "are we really going to have corazon again?" Elena knelt beside her daughter, pulling her close as she studied the drawing that had grown more elaborate over the months. Sofia had added a garden full of green scribbles, tables sized for families of all configurations, and above it all, a heart that seemed to pulse with love and hope. "I don't know exactly what it will look like yet, mi amor," Elena said honestly. "But yes, I think we're going to have something called corazon again. Something that honors Bisabuela's memory and serves our community and makes sure no one goes hungry." "Will it have the secret ingredient?" Sofia asked. "The cilantro de monte that makes everything taste like home." Elena smiled, thinking about the wild cilantro that had grown back in the abandoned lot despite concrete and neglect, surviving because some things are too stubborn and too essential to be permanently destroyed. "Yes, mi cielo. It will definitely have the secret ingredient." As the Miami sun set on a day that had changed everything, Elena Martinez sat in her small apartment with her daughter, planning a future that honored the past while embracing possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Somewhere across the city, Marcus Wellington stood in his empty tower, looking down at the lights of a community he was finally beginning to understand. The soup kitchen would open again tomorrow night, as it did every Tuesday and Thursday. But now it would serve more than food, it would serve as proof that sometimes, when we feed each other with open hearts, the universe finds ways to feed us back in measure pressed down and running over. The ripples of kindness, once released into the world, have a way of coming home. 1 year later, the autumn air in Little Havana carried the aroma of sofrito and possibility as Elena Martinez stood in the doorway of what had once been her grandmother's dream and was now becoming something even more magnificent. The space that would soon house the new Corazon Community Center bore little resemblance to the original restaurant, yet somehow it felt like a homecoming. The building itself was a testament to what happened when business acumen met community wisdom. Marcus Wellington had insisted on using the finest architects and contractors, but every decision had been filtered through Elena's vision of what the neighborhood needed. The result was a space that breathed with warmth and purpose, a commercial kitchen large enough to serve both paying customers and community programs, meeting rooms where local organizations could gather, and a childcare center where working parents could leave their children in safe, loving hands. But it was the garden that made Elena's heart sing every time she saw it. Where concrete and steel had once stood in sterile perfection, now rows of vegetables and herbs grew in carefully tended plots. The cilantro de monte that had survived in wild patches had been cultivated and expanded, its distinctive aroma mixing with basil, oregano, and the mint that Sofia had insisted on planting because restaurants need to smell like all kinds of love, mommy. "The inspector is here," Elena called Carmen Rodriguez, who had taken a leave of absence from her nursing job to help manage the center's opening. Carmen's transformation over the past year had been almost as remarkable as the building itself. The bitterness and worry that had lined her face had given way to something that looked surprisingly like joy. Elena smoothed her apron, a new one, embroidered with the Corazon logo that Sofia had designed, and walked toward the main dining area where the final inspection would determine whether they could open their doors to the public next week. The space was warm and inviting, with exposed brick walls that honored the neighborhood's history and large windows that let in the golden Miami sunshine. 60 families now lived in the affordable cooperative housing that had replaced Marcus's luxury condominiums. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Some of the original residents had chosen to sell and relocate, unable to adjust to the idea of shared ownership and community responsibility. But those who remained had formed something unprecedented in Miami's development history, a true cooperative where decisions were made collectively and profits were shared equitably. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly patient Elena had served at Miami General, now lived in a ground-floor unit specifically designed for seniors, with grab bars and wide doorways and a view of the community garden that she tended with the dedication of someone who had finally found home. Tommy, the Vietnam veteran, had been hired as the building's maintenance coordinator, his mechanical skills and natural leadership creating a sense of security and pride among the residents. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation belonged to Marcus Wellington himself. Elena spotted him now, standing in the corner of the dining room with a measuring tape and clipboard, checking the spacing between tables with the same meticulous attention to detail he had once applied to luxury developments. He wore work clothes, actual work clothes, not the carefully distressed costumes from his documentary experiment, and his hands bore the calluses that came from months of physical labor. "Marcus," Elena called, and he looked up with a smile that still surprised her with its genuine warmth. "The inspector needs to see the kitchen equipment." "Of course," he replied, setting down his clipboard. "Everything should be in order." The installation crew finished the final calibrations yesterday. Their working relationship had evolved slowly over the past year, moving from wary cooperation to genuine partnership to something that felt increasingly like friendship. Marcus had thrown himself into the project with an intensity that bordered on obsession, as if creating something beautiful from the wreckage of his past mistakes could somehow balance the scales of his existence. He had also thrown most of his remaining fortune into the project. The property transfer had been just the beginning. Marcus had funded the construction, the equipment, the operating budget for the first 3 years, and a scholarship program that would send local high school students to culinary school. He now lived in a modest apartment 3 blocks away, having sold his penthouse and most of his possessions to finance what he called the most important investment of my life. "You know," Elena said as they walked toward the kitchen, "you don't have to be here for every inspection, every delivery, every meeting. I trust you." Marcus paused in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at the gleaming equipment that would soon be used to create magic from simple ingredients. "I know you trust me," he said quietly. "But I'm not sure I trust myself yet. Every day I work on this project, I remember a little more about who I used to want to be before I forgot that money was supposed to be a tool, not a goal." The kitchen inspection went smoothly, everything was up to code, properly installed, ready to serve both the restaurant that would occupy the space during the day and the expanded soup kitchen that would operate 3 evenings a week. Elena ran her hands over the surfaces that would soon be covered with the organized chaos of meal preparation, thinking about her grandmother's wooden spoon and her daughter's drawings and the long journey that had brought them to this moment. "Mommy!" Sophia's voice echoed through the dining room as she burst through the front door, still wearing her school uniform but with dirt on her knees from helping Father Santos plant herbs in the community garden. At 9 years old, she had grown into her role as unofficial ambassador of the project, charming contractors and city officials with equal ease. "How was school, mi amor?" Elena asked, gathering her daughter into a hug that smelled of sunshine and growing things. "Mrs. Rodriguez says I can help serve food when we open," Sophia announced proudly. "And David is going to interview me for his story about kids in community development." David Chen had become a fixture in their lives over the past year, documenting the transformation of the property and the people involved in it. His initial investigative report had evolved into an ongoing series about community-based development, and his relationship with Elena had evolved into something that made her blush when Sophia asked pointed questions about why the nice reporter man came to dinner so often. Speaking of David, Marcus said with a grin that suggested he enjoyed Elena's mild embarrassment, "He's waiting in the office with the advance copies of his book." Elena's eyebrows rose. "Book? Didn't I mention?" Sophia said innocently, in a tone that suggested she knew perfectly well she hadn't mentioned it. "David wrote a book about you and Marcus and Corazon and how soup can change the world. He says it's going to make you famous." As they walked toward the small office space that Elena would use to coordinate the center's programs, she marveled at how much had changed in the past year. Not just the physical transformation of the property, but the expansion of her own world in ways she never could have imagined. The Corazon Community Center had attracted attention from urban planners and social entrepreneurs across the country. Elena had been invited to speak at conferences about community development, food justice, and what one journalist had called the economics of compassion. She had traveled to cities she had only read about, sharing her grandmother's wisdom about feeding people and building community. But more than the recognition, more than the opportunities, was the simple satisfaction of work that aligned with her deepest values. Every decision about the center was filtered through a simple question: would this serve the community? Would this honor her grandmother's memory? Would this create more love in the world? David's book, titled The Soup Kitchen Millionaire, A Story of Hunger, Healing, and Hope, told the story of their unlikely partnership with the kind of attention to detail and emotional honesty that had made him one of Miami's most respected journalists. The advance copy he handed Elena was inscribed simply, "For Elena Martinez, who proved that the best way to find yourself is to feed someone else." "I have some other news," David said, his professional demeanor not quite concealing his excitement. "The James Beard Foundation wants to give you their humanitarian award. And there's a publisher interested in a cookbook based on your grandmother's recipes." Elena shook her head, overwhelmed by the continuing expansion of opportunities that seemed to flow from their simple act of creating community around food. "I just want to cook, David. I just want to feed people." "And that," said Father Santos, entering the office with the quiet authority that still made everyone sit up a little straighter, "is exactly why you deserve the recognition." The priest had aged in the past year, his silver hair now completely white, but his eyes held a satisfaction that spoke of prayers answered in ways more beautiful than he had dared to hope. St. Catherine's Soup Kitchen now operated from a purpose-built facility in the community center, serving 3 times as many people as before with the help of volunteers recruited from the cooperative housing residents. "I have news too," Father Santos announced, settling into a chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested the Miami humidity. "Isabella Wellington has been accepted to culinary school with a full scholarship from the Esperanza Martinez Memorial Fund." Marcus looked up sharply. His daughter Isabella had reconnected with him tentatively over the past year, drawn first by curiosity about his dramatic change in lifestyle and gradually by genuine respect for the work he was doing. At 17, she had discovered a passion for cooking that reminded Marcus painfully of Elena's dedication to her craft. "She wants to apprentice here next summer," Father Santos continued, "learning from Elena before she starts school in the fall." Elena felt tears prick her eyes as she thought about the circle being completed, the granddaughter of the man who had honored her grandmother's contract learning to cook from the woman whose family had been displaced by his grandson's ambition. The symmetry was too perfect to be coincidence, too meaningful to be anything but grace. "Of course," she said. "We'll teach her everything we know about putting heart into food." As the afternoon light slanted through the windows of the community center, Elena looked around at the faces of the people who had become her chosen family. Carmen, whose nursing skills now served the community health clinic that operated from the center's 2nd floor. Marcus, whose business acumen was now dedicated to ensuring that their model could be replicated in other communities. David, whose storytelling was helping change the conversation about poverty and possibility. Father Santos, whose belief in redemption had made all of this possible. And Sophia, who had never known the original Corazon but who carried its spirit in her DNA, already talking about the restaurant she would run someday and the people she would feed and the love she would ladle into bowls for anyone hungry enough to receive it. "Mommy," Sophia said, tugging on Elena's apron, "when we open next week, can we have a special dinner for all the people who helped build this place?" Elena smiled, thinking about her grandmother's wooden spoon waiting at home, ready to stir love into whatever came next. "Yes, mi cielo. We'll have a feast. We'll make enough food for everyone who's hungry, and we'll set extra places at every table." "Why extra places?" Marcus asked. "Because," Elena said, her voice carrying the wisdom of 3 generations of women who understood that abundance comes from sharing, not hoarding. "You never know who might walk through the door needing to be fed. And in this family, everyone eats." Outside the windows of the Corazon Community Center, Miami pulsed with its usual rhythm of ambition and dreams. But inside, in the space where a grandmother's vision had been destroyed and reborn, something revolutionary was taking root, proof that when we choose to feed each other with open hearts, the universe conspires to ensure that everyone has enough. The legacy of Esperanza Martinez lived on, not just in recipes and spices and the taste of home, but in the radical notion that business could serve community, that wealth could be measured in full bellies and warm hearts, and that sometimes the most important ingredient in any dish is the willingness to share it with strangers who might become family. Elena Martinez had lost everything and found something better. She had given soup to a beggar and discovered that grace has a way of coming full circle, bringing us exactly what we need when we're ready to receive it. The doors of Corazon would open again next week. But the real feast, the one that nourishes souls instead of just bodies, had already begun. And so ends the story of Elena Martinez and Marcus Wellington, a reminder that kindness is never wasted, that redemption is always possible, and that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simple act of feeding someone who's hungry. In our world of division and inequality, may we all find ways to see past our differences to the shared humanity that connects us all. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that hope is real, that change is possible, and that love, like soup, multiplies when we give it away. And remember, you never know when the stranger you help today might become the miracle you need tomorrow. The end.